Daniel, thanks so much for being here today. It's great to have you. You'll be able to tell that you've got a New Zealander up here chatting to an Israeli, which is true Bloomberg's international spirit. I hope you all managed to follow along because Daniel has some great insights into the future of mobility for us today. Daniel, I actually wanted to start off not on the future of mobility, which is the topic of our panel, but actually talking about your bio. I don't know if anyone in the audience had a chance to read it, but Daniel's a pretty interesting guy. He was a graduate of the Israeli Defense Forces Talpiot program, which is the most elite and secretive program in the Israel Defense Force. And you also have a PhD in neuroscience from Stanford and used to build supercomputers. So can you tell us, how did you end up here talking about mobility?
Thanks, Olivia, for that intro. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think the only thing I can say is that it was probably a momentary lapse of judgment, and I'll probably leave it at that. But I do think mobility is an incredibly interesting space that is transforming very rapidly with just incredible opportunities to do different things. We're all familiar with some of the big companies in space, Lyft, Uber, and so forth, but looking more broadly, we really believe that there's an opportunity to bring in very sophisticated software and algorithms to transform the space in a huge way. Okay,
if we could just backtrack for a little bit. How did you get here today, Daniel?
I took a Via.
Appropriate answer from the co-founder and CEO of Via. Via is a ride-sharing app, and it's often described as a rival to Uber and Lyft. We're aware that Via has given more than 70 million rides around the globe, yet it only has a small fraction of the overall rideshare market. I think it's about 3% in New York. So if we look to see how dominant Uber and Lyft are here, is there any point in even competing for third place, or is that not really Via's overall goal?
So I think you're right. We are often described in the press as a rival to Uber and Lyft. I would say that characterization is highly inaccurate. That really isn't what we have ever tried to do. We have a ride-sharing service that I use to come here that you can, hopefully you're all downloading, those of you on your phones right now, that's exactly what you're doing. You're downloading our app, which you can find in the App Store. And you can use Via in New York, Chicago, London, Amsterdam, to get around just like you would an Uber or Lyft. But our focus is on shared rides, so 95+% of our passengers are sharing their rides with other passengers. And the way we started was always to think about Via providing a service that's much more akin to a public transit service, to a dynamic bus service. Mm-hmm. We started out, and we can talk more about it, operating our own dynamic shuttle or dynamic bus service here in New York, expanded it to a few other cities. But really, the core of what we've been doing, and this is particularly accelerated the last few years, is to take that core technology that enables buses, small buses, shuttles, sometimes even smaller cars, to be routed dynamically in real time based on demand very efficiently, and provide that technology to cities, to transit operators, to transit authorities to enable their public transit systems to operate far more efficiently. And we do that all over the world. We have, at this point, nearly 100 different partners, including in New Zealand, where our software powers dynamic on-demand public transportation.
I think that's interesting because when we think about the history of Uber, it was started to disrupt the taxi or the limousine industry. It was black private cars for those who could afford it, whereas it sounds like Via is more targeting those who use public transport daily. It's trying to make it more affordable for the everyday commuter, right?
That's right. And so if you look at what's happening in transportation, we have private transportation, your car, which is chock full of technology. If you go out and buy a new, say just randomly, Mercedes E-Class, the amount of technology in that car or in a Tesla is massive. And that's sort of one end of the spectrum. And then you look at the other end of the spectrum, you get onto your normal common city bus, and that is probably about as low tech as you might imagine. There's also in between taxis and car rentals, and mobile technology is coming in and changing those spaces very dramatically. We have companies like Turo and GetAround that allow you to use your phone to rent a car from another person. So the car rental space is being transformed. You've got the taxi space, obviously, as you said, Olivia, with Uber and Lyft taking what was originally a few tens of billions of dollars a year around the world and transforming that and growing that dramatically. And then you've got what we're really focused on, which we call public mobility, which is everything to do with buses, school buses, paratransit, shuttles, corporate shuttles, university shuttles. And that space turns out to be close to $500 billion a year globally. It's a much bigger space than the ride-hailing or taxi space, in our view, and has the potential to really transform through technology. Technology penetration in public mobility is very close to zero, and there's a real opportunity to do something about it.
Cool. And with VIA, you're partnering up with a large number of cities, and including New York City. In August, you announced that you have this partnership with the Department of Education to run the transport or software system behind the public school buses. And what exactly does that look like, and how is that going to improve the way kids are getting to school faster and safer, say?
So this is a great example. The yellow school bus system in New York City has about 9,500 buses, 150,000 kids who get to school every day using the system across the city. If you think about your experience, I have 3 kids here in New York in public school. If you think about your experience of taking a public school bus, you go down to the corner at 7:30 a.m. and you wait. Sometimes the bus comes, hopefully mostly, sometimes it doesn't. You put your kid on the bus, you have no idea if she or he are actually getting there. And then you go back down at 2:30 p.m. and you wait. And then at some point the bus hopefully again shows up and your child is still on it. That's not really how we are used to thinking about transportation these days. And so adding a layer of technology to that where your child can get on the bus and maybe scan on with a QR code or scan off just like you would on an airplane, that you can, as a parent, have an app where you can track where the bus is, where your child is, where the routing for these school buses, which you might think of as a very static problem. You set all the routes in advance in the summer, and that's it. But the reality is that that's not how it works. There are a lot of kids who are in shelters, homeless shelters, who are moving around the city quite a bit, or in foster families. About 50,000 of those 150,000 kids are special needs kids whose needs are constantly evolving. And having a system that's far more dynamic, that can adapt to the fact that a lot of times the bus drivers don't show up in the morning to take the bus and drive it wherever they need. So the city has to scramble every day to adapt that system. And so we believe that, and that, by the way, is a $1.3 billion a year operating the budget that the Office of People Transportation of New York City is spending on moving these kids around every day. And so providing technology that will make that more efficient, save taxpayer money, get kids more safely where they need to go every day and more regularly, we think is a very important thing that we should be involved in, and we're very happy to partner with the Department of Education here and the city to do that.
If we could shift gears a little bit, we've seen Uber and Lyft struggle with profitability since entering the public markets. Any concerns there for VIA?
So I think the operations, so the ones that you of course have all downloaded your apps, will be using soon here in New York. Those are that market is very competitive and generally has been capital intensive. We do see it rationalizing somewhat. We do see prices going up and the economics of that improving significantly. So that piece, I think, it'd be interesting to see how that evolves. What we call our consumer service. The bulk of what we do, which again is partnering with transit agencies, that's a very different business where we are simply providing our software as a service, as a SaaS, or providing a transportation solution as a service, what we call TaaS, very creatively. That is a very different business financially, and one that's much more easily run.
Cool. Now if we could kind of zoom in on the purpose of this panel, which is the future of mobility. In your mind, what is mobility going to look like 5 years from now?
I don't know that I know. I would say that there's going to be a lot more mobility that you are, and I think that's going to be true everywhere in cities, but also in less dense environments, suburban environments, where you are using a mobile device to book, summon, schedule some sort of trip. And I think that's going to become increasingly more common for people. It's certainly as this technology enters the public mobility space. So, ride-hailing services, DD, UberLyft are one thing. They're relatively high cost. Not everybody can use them, I believe. And one of the issues we've seen in the space is that there was initially a thesis that they would be ubiquitous. Everybody would be using Uber. You'd give up your private vehicle and just use a ride-hailing service. I think that it's turned out that the cost structure, at least so long as we don't have autonomous vehicles everywhere, the cost structure doesn't necessarily support that. But if we're able to bring this technology into the public transportation, public mobility space, where the cost is much lower, that's going to really expand access. And a lot more people are going to be using their phones to summon transportation. So I think that's a pretty big transition, where we'll see people moving away from their private cars. We're also seeing cities increasingly getting frustrated with the amount of, and residents with the congestion, with the pollution. Environmental concerns are playing a bigger role. So I think moving towards more shared mobility, more electrification, lower emissions types of solutions is also going to be a big piece of the puzzle.
You just flicked at autonomous vehicles in your answer, and it would be great if we could turn to the audience. We have a polling question on this topic exactly. We wanted to ask you, when will automated vehicles be driving around New York City's streets? So if you want to pull out your phones and jump in, we've got 4 different options. Before 2025, between 2025 and 2035, 2035 or after, and number D is just never. I wonder, as they're putting their answers in, Daniel, what are your thoughts on that?
I picked the middle one.
Which
between
is?
20 and 20, I guess there are 4. Between 2025 and 2035.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was the safest choice, frankly.
Based on?
It's just really hard to know, right? If you would
Looks
ask
like people are following you now.
Yeah, thank you guys for supporting me. I was a little worried. I think if you're looking at what people thought 2 years, I bet if we were doing this survey 2 years ago, I don't know if you guys would agree with me, a lot more people would have picked the before 2025 option. Maybe even just as little as 6 months ago, maybe people would have done that. I think it's becoming clearer that this is a much harder problem than perhaps we anticipated. So I think before 2025, there's some chance, but it's certainly not guaranteed. However, in my kind of limited experience, these types of innovations have a tendency to take a really long time and then happen all at once. So it's sort of, it's not happening, and then all of a sudden it's here. And my guess was that it's not going to take too many more years before there are a few breakthroughs that make autonomous vehicles a reality. It's probably not 2 to 5, but maybe 10 to 15, 5 to 15 seems reasonable.
Great. And for those of us who were here earlier today, we heard Brad Stone ask David Siegel of 2 Sigma if driverless vehicles were overrated or underrated. And his answer was that they were overrated, and he added, get out of the way when one is coming down the road. Do you think those concerns over safety are justified?
So whether there's a concern with safety of autonomous vehicles?
Oh yeah, he's saying if an autonomous vehicle is coming towards you, run.
Run. I mean, it's hard to argue. Safety is going to be a huge issue, and we're going to need to make sure that, I think there's going to be very little, while we have honestly some difficult to explain tolerance for the fact that I think it's 35,000 people across the United States are killed every year by humans driving vehicles. We seem to have, and it's understandable, an extremely low tolerance to the idea that a robot-driven vehicle will kill, someone, another human. And so I think those concerns are very serious, and we'll have to address them. If I had to guess, I think one way that makes it relatively easy to resolve is to create dedicated infrastructure where the autonomous vehicles are separated from pedestrians, or separated from us, and therefore reduce the risk massively that someone will get run over by an autonomous vehicle. And we build dedicated infrastructure for many things, for the subway, for trains, for buses, dedicated lanes for buses, for trams. So it's not crazy, I think, that we will start to see increasingly dedicated lanes that are protected for autonomous vehicles, and that reduces a lot of that challenge.
Right, but what about like cyber attack? That's been a hot topic of this conference so far today. And when we talk about the concerns for automated vehicles, one consideration would be a cyber attack that could cause an accident or a giant traffic jam. How are rideshare companies going to deal with this issue?
Yeah, I think that's an important concern. It applies across everything that we're automating. Autonomous vehicles is one, but we are automating every piece of our world, and I think cybersecurity, it sounds like you guys have talked about it a lot, is a big concern. I don't know that it's any different than kind of automating our grid, our electric grid, or our water supply, or our traffic control systems, or any other such system. So I'm not sure this is necessary, or our electoral systems, frankly. I'm not sure this is any worse, but certainly a concern.
And talking about the future of mobility, I feel like we also need to bring in e-scooters and e-bikes. Do you think that these have a permanent place in transit in cities, or do you think they're just a temporary fad?
No, I think they're an important piece. I don't know how big they are. I don't know if you were to go to pick a random city in the Midwest in the U.S. that you could argue that 40% of the population is going to be getting around on scooters. That's probably not the case. But I do think that there are certain parts of the world where those modes of travel are going to be important. I think what makes, and that's our view at VIA too, what makes a city great from a mobility perspective is when you have options. I think what makes New York City or London or Paris or Tokyo great cities to live in is that you can walk, bike, scoot, take the subway, take a bus, drive, take in some cases a via UberLyft, what have you, some other cases not. I think that's part of just giving people options is what makes cities great places to live.
And as the boundaries between private, public, and shared ways of transport or moving around cities get increasingly blurred, how do you see these new forms of mobility impacting the fight against climate change?
Yeah, so I think I do see, we see it when we're talking to cities, we do see cities, it's more so in Europe, less so in the US, but we do see cities increasingly care about climate issues and about whether the vehicles we are going to use are low emissions vehicles or electric. So people are, whereas 3 years ago that may not have been a big part of the conversation, I think today they really are. And I think that there's always going to be private cars, people riding around by themselves, but my hope is that increasingly we will look at people riding around by themselves in a car a little bit the way we might think about someone walking into a kindergarten and smoking. It's just should not be done. It's not good for anybody. It's certainly not good for all of us, around that person. And so I think it's important to start to think about the environmental impact and try to use more shared modes. Please do.
So we've got less than a minute to go. I wanted to sneak in one last question. I put it out on Twitter that I was going to be talking to you today, and I asked if anyone had a question that they wanted to pose to Daniel, and I did have one come back that I thought was kind of entertaining.
I wrote that one.
It was, how close are we to George and Jane Jetson's car?
To George and Jane?
And Jane Jetson's car.
I don't know that I know the cultural reference. I apologize.
You haven't watched the Jetsons show? Okay. Maybe. Well, I was going to say bonus points if you said sooner than you think, but we may just have to wrap it up there.
I'll leave that as a question for the audience.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Daniel.